Hello, welcome to this next Flip Preaching video. My name's Andy, and a special welcome if you're joining us new this week. So we're going to have a look at the Gospel passage, which we'll look at on Sunday more fully in a sort of a worship setting. So the passage is John 9, 1 to 41. Now, have you printed off your sheet? There'll be a link somewhere below this video if you haven't already. And perhaps you would want to print this off, and then you've got something to refer to and highlight as you go. No obligation, but if you'd like to, that's an option. So this is an amazing story, actually. It's a really, really great story, and as usual, it's packed with so many layers of meaning. One of the commentaries I read on this said that this is the most artistically, the most literally beautiful creation in John's Gospel, because it's so cleverly put together. So it's the story of a man who was blind from birth, who's healed by Jesus, and the miraculous part of it happens and is passed very swiftly. Because then the bulk of the story, and it's quite a long story, the bulk of the story involves the religious authorities trying to unpack what happened, and we get an insight into some of the tensions at the time. Okay, so I want to say at the outset that this passage creates a real problem for us today, because it uses an analogy for sinfulness and separation from God that we would never use today. It kind of relies on this idea that being blind is like being sinful, that people who can't see physically are a kind of way to understand what it means to not understand God. Now, in today's society, you would never do that, and I can only apologise for that, but we've got this in the scripture. But this in no way, in no shape or way means that people who are blind or have any sort of physical impairment implies that they're in any way sinful. It's just purely a metaphor for people who don't manage to see God, even though they could. So with that at the start, we get this man who's born blind, and Jesus heals him. And Jesus says the beautiful phrase, "I am the light of the world." This is where Jesus says that. A couple of weeks ago, if you've got a very good memory, you might have remembered in Matthew's Gospel, we talked about a passage where Jesus says that you are the light of the world to the disciples. But here, Jesus says that he is the light of the world. And he's the one who brings goodness and wholeness and positivity into a bad situation. So the metaphor of light shining in the darkness is very much at the heart of this. So this man was born blind, and then Jesus helps him to see, and he becomes a great model of a convert, a follower of Jesus, as the story goes on. The religious authorities, the twist in the tale at the end of it, if you get to the end of this passage, so around about 38, so John 9:38, is that the people who should see God, the ones who are professional religious people who spend all their life trying to help people connect with God, it ends up with them being blind, because although physically they can see, they miss what God is doing in the middle of it. So there's a beautifully clever twist in the story that this poor humble man who was a beggar, I think it says somewhere in the passage, he ends up being the one who sees God, and the ones who should see God, due to their own narrow-mindedness, they fail to. The way that Jesus heals this man is really interesting, I think. It sounds a bit gross too. Jesus spits into some mud, and it makes a kind of muddy clay, and then puts that on the man's eyes. I think it's fascinating that Jesus did this, because they were the sort of things that people tried to do back in the day to heal people who were blind. This was kind of like folk medicine, folk magic, if you like. This is the sort of things that people would do. There's an account of a Roman soldier at this kind of time who felt that to cure his blindness, he should mix hen's blood with honey and put that on his eyes, and apparently that cured his sight. So the idea of making a paste and rubbing it on your eyes was a kind of common thing at the time to cure blindness, like kind of a witch doctor cure almost. And Jesus does it. I don't understand why Jesus had to do that, but we get a beautiful blend anyway of the natural and the supernatural combining to provide the healing that this man needs. Now, at the moment, of course, we're in the midst, or perhaps in just the early stages of an enormous medical emergency, the like of which the world hasn't seen for a long time. So I think we can take from this the message that God can work with natural means to bring healing, and we should look for that and celebrate it wherever we can. There's an irony, actually, in that touching someone's eye is a good thing in this story, but at the moment it's something we're all being advised not to do. We're all being advised to wash our hands and to not get them dirty, and to certainly not touch our eyes as much as we used to. We're not supposed to touch our faces. So there's a kind of funny irony here in that the exact thing Jesus did would be bad news today. You don't want people touching your eyes anymore. But the things that we do we can still do things which are the opposite of this, which are good for people. Things like keeping ourselves apart from them, washing our hands, trying to keep a distance, staying at home as much as possible. In these days, these are physical things that we can do which will have a healing effect on society. So we should see these as the equivalent of Jesus mixing up mud and spit. Our equivalent today is washing our hands, staying away, staying at home, cutting down on contact as much as possible. And we pray that God will be involved in that and bring healing and restoration. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about was the idea of sin, because the word sin occurs time and time and time again in this story, and it seems to be an important recurring theme of who is sinful. And by sin, perhaps it's not talking particularly about doing something wrong, like a sinful act. It's talking about a state of separation from God. So being blind is used as this metaphor for sin. So people who just don't get God, people who don't connect with the divine. And the man who was born blind, there's a discussion which starts off with the disciples but goes throughout the whole story. They tried to work out whose fault it was that he was born blind. People back then clearly thought that if something went wrong, it was because of sin, because you'd distanced yourself from God. That somehow meant that that's why this bad thing happened to you. So people thought that, if something bad happens, it's probably because you've been sinful. You've been separated from God for whatever reason that may be. Because this man was born blind, it raised a bit of a theological conundrum, if you think along these lines, because he was born that way, so he couldn't have done anything wrong beforehand. So they were asking about whether his parents were at fault. Jesus has a brilliant answer, as he always does. He makes it really clear that nobody sinned. His blindness, his disability, the bad thing that shaped this man's life was nothing to do with sinfulness. Nothing to do with it at all. In these times when this coronavirus is spreading, occasionally I hear or see posts that people put on social media which kind of imply that this is God's punishment, because I don't know who he's punishing, but it's somehow this thing is sent by God to punish us or to test us or to drive us back to him, to kind of coerce people to come back to God. And I think from passages like this and other ones, like in Luke 13, verses 2 to 3, when we get a similar question emerging, there is no culprit. The bad things that happen in this world, they're not because God wanted them to happen as a punishment. That is not the way God works. We see in Jesus a God who always, always, always acts to love and to heal and to restore, not to cause suffering. Jesus says that the reason why this man was blind was so that God's glory might be seen. And what we think that means is that it was a way that God could, not that God never causes bad things to happen, but when bad things do happen, God can manipulate the situation and bring good things out of it. And I think that's what I would say is happening in this story. And that's what we can look for in this coronavirus situation. It's a terrible thing. God did not intend this to happen, in my opinion. This is not from God. But in the midst of all of the mess and the chaos and the sadness and the grief, we can expect that God will be manipulating the bad situation to do something good if we have the eyes to see it. It turns out that the people who should know how God works, the Pharisees in this story, they accuse Jesus of being sinful because he heals this person on the Sabbath. Jesus breaks the rules. You weren't allowed to heal people unless they were critically ill. This man wasn't in danger of dying on the Sabbath. He could have waited a day. And Jesus shouldn't have mixed up this mud, clay stuff, because that again counts as work, something you shouldn't do on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees think that Jesus is sinful because he broke the religious rules. But he did something good. He did something amazing. And we see at the end of the story that actually it's the blindness of the Pharisees, not literally, but metaphorically, blindness of the Pharisees. They cannot see that healing someone and restoring someone's sight is an amazing gift from God, that Jesus is on the right side of history on this one. They don't get that. And that means that they are the ones who find themselves blinded from God, separated from God. They're the ones who end up in this state of sinfulness or separation. So there's a huge amount in this story. But in these troubling times, may we know, A, that God is light and brings goodness and healing into the world. May we know that in the midst of difficult situations, in the midst of the medical profession kicking into their most challenging hour, that God will be working with them to provide healing and restoration. And may we know that God never sends bad things. God doesn't send punishment to us. God is a healing, restoring God. And through the mess of this situation, may we see God's glory emerging out of the dirt and the mud and the chaos of this situation. Okay, well, they're my thoughts on this passage. I wonder what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear what you think about this. This is John 9, 1-41. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.